G27, resuming the debate adjourned on June 3rd, 2025 on the motion for second reading of Bill 27, an act to enact the Geologic Carbon Storage Act 2025 and to amend various acts with respect to wildfires, resource safety, and surveyors.
Further debate. I recognize the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's my honor, not always my pleasure, to rise in this House to debate this bill. And there are a few things that I want to address. I'm focused primarily on the carbon storage, the geologic storage. My colleague, the MPP from Mushkegowuk, yesterday dealt with the other aspects of the bill, although I will speak a bit about the fire services. There's a lot wrong with the geologic storage portion of this bill. And I think the first part has to do with the potential risk that comes from going ahead with pumping large amounts of carbon dioxide into fractured rock in southern Ontario without having done a study in advance as the potential risks. So, Speaker, if you get a chance, if you Google abandoned oil and gas wells in Ontario, CBC has a really detailed map showing roughly the 27,000 abandoned oil and gas wells in Ontario. Many people may not know that Ontario is one of the leading pioneers in developing the oil and gas industry in the 19th century. Petrolia, Ontario got its name not by accident. In fact, we were ahead of the United States in terms of developing oil and gas. We were pioneers. And the oil and gas industry in the 19th century took full advantage of the geology of this area, and continuing on into the 20th century, even today, we still produce oil and gas in Ontario. About 1% of our total supply comes from Ontario itself. What this means, though, Speaker, is that we have literally tens of thousands of abandoned oil and gas wells across Ontario, heavily concentrated in a band that runs from the south end of the Niagara Peninsula along Lake Erie all the way to Windsor, Essex. And people may be familiar with the explosions that happened in Wheatley, Ontario, a number of years ago, covered extensively by the Globe and Mail. Failure on the part of the Ontario government to actually monitor, take action on, cap, and make safe those abandoned oil and gas wells. So we have literally tens of thousands that are still seeping gas, seeping oil, with the risk that comes from that. This bill allows those who are interested to pump carbon dioxide into abandoned wells to flush out the remaining oil and gas. I have problems with that. I think we need to be making a move away from fossil fuels. We have a climate crisis, and if I have the time, I'll get into greater detail on that. But unfortunately, in the course of developing this bill, what we in the official opposition found was the government had not actually done a study of the potential harms that come from pumping that carbon dioxide into those abandoned and old wells. We don't know if pumping in one place will cause oil and gas to bubble up in another place. So you've got a farmer's field, you've got an old oil and gas well, you may not have thought about it, may not have seen it, it may be covered in dirt and just seeping some natural gas. But once someone starts pressurizing that pool underground, then one could assume there's a risk you'll start seeing oil bubble up in farmers' fields where farmers for the last few decades have seen no oil activity whatsoever. You may not see it, you may not smell it, but natural gas may come up as well, in or near buildings. So you're setting yourselves up, we are being set up potentially, because no study's been done, and we can't say with any certainty whether what's going to be done is safe or harmful. Potentially setting up situations where we're getting oil leakage into agricultural fields, into what are now developed areas, gas into buildings or into fields, That is a huge issue. And frankly, this shouldn't be going forward until the study has been done to establish that this can be done without precipitating those oil and gas leaks from wells that have been long abandoned and not properly capped, not properly sealed. That's a big issue. The second issue that I think is very important is this sense of why we're going to be pumping carbon dioxide into subterranean spaces. And if you look through the number of documents that have been put out by the government on this particular project, obviously the one thing to do is stimulate oil and gas production. I've already talked about the risk there, setting aside even the climate implications. But part of what's being done here is to provide a place to put the carbon dioxide when you make hydrogen. And hydrogen, overwhelmingly, is made not by electrolysis, not by putting a current through water to separate hydrogen and oxygen. No, it's made by taking natural gas or methane and with a very expensive and very energy-intensive process, breaking that natural gas into its component parts, freeing the hydrogen so it can be pumped and sold, and taking the carbon dioxide. Now, currently, the carbon dioxide is just simply vented to the atmosphere. What's suggested here in the process that we've been given is that that carbon dioxide will be captured and pumped underground. Speaker, when you actually start to go through the studies on this so-called blue hydrogen, green hydrogen being the one that emits no carbon dioxide, but blue hydrogen emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, you'll find that, in fact, the carbon dioxide emissions are very, very substantial. That the geologic capture of carbon dioxide is far less effective than is claimed. And when you look at fields or industrial processes in Europe, they report an extraordinarily expensive process, getting that carbon dioxide underground, but a very leaky process. And in general, the assessment of the environmental community is that making this blue hydrogen can be as damaging or more damaging than just simply burning natural gas in the first place. Speaker, if you say you're trying to make things better for the environment, and in fact what you're doing is, at a minimum, continuing the level of damage that you're seeing now, or, as is entirely likely, making things worse, I don't understand why on earth we would be doing this. The other element in this, or reason that's given, is that we need to take carbon dioxide from industries that are hard to clean up. Industries like cement that, at the heart of the process, are releasing carbon dioxide. And again, I go back to the European experience, which is of geologic storage, of taking the carbon dioxide and pumping it underground into rock formations, being extremely expensive and, frankly, very faulty, so that you continue to get substantial leakage. It would make lots more sense for us as a society, if we're going to do this, to invest in those industries to help them make the transition away from burning oil or gas or coal in order to make their product. That would economically make a lot more sense than what's being proposed here. So for me, it seems that the process that we're engaged in is far more driven by the need to give a cover story to the natural gas industry to make their blue hydrogen and say that what they're doing is environmentally defensible, and giving an opportunity for the oil and gas industry to squeeze a few last drops out of the lemon to get the remaining oil and gas out of the rocks underlying southern Ontario. That is not a credible approach. But I think on top of all this is the government's argument that this is somehow going to help with fighting climate change. And I don't think this government has any commitment to doing that, frankly, so I don't think it's credible when they make that argument. But beyond that, I think the government fails to recognize the scale and scope of risk that we're facing as a society. Now, today, you can look up and you can see the smoke from fires burning Northern Ontario, Western Canada, and get a sense that here, at the beginning of June, we are facing a crisis in wildfires that is driving people from their homes, and that will only get worse as the world gets hotter. And yet, at the same time, this government has no credible plan to take on that issue. We are in a situation where, as of April this year, reporting by the Government of Canada showed that Ontario continues to climb, to increase its emissions, while almost all the other Canadian provinces are seeing reductions. So, 2018, this government was elected. That year and the year after, emissions went up. COVID came along. This provinces right across this country saw a big drop in emissions. And as the pandemic eased, we saw a growth in emissions, most notably in Ontario and Alberta. But Alberta actually had this year, I think they leveled out, whereas Ontario grew. So this government is not, in fact, taking on this issue. And it isn't just the wildfire smoke that we see. If you look a little bit into the future, and you can look a bit into the future by looking at 6 o'clock news broadcasts from Louisiana and Florida. And I know that's sort of an odd source, but the reality in those jurisdictions is that as extreme weather ramps up, and as it is ramping up more slowly here, but we'll get there, insurance companies are pulling out. They are saying these places are not insurable. And so increasingly, homeowners are either finding, A, they can't renew their insurance, or the price for renewal is beyond their means. And in some cases, that means that people are moving. In some cases, it means that people, as they say on the 6 o'clock news in Fort Lauderdale, are going bare. They are going forward without any house insurance. That, Speaker, puts them at a tremendous risk of either crushing debt or homelessness in the years to come. We need to recognize that reality. And because those insurance losses are mounting in Louisiana, in Florida, in California, the North American insurance industry is spreading those costs around. So you will see upward pressure on insurance costs in Ontario from the losses insurance companies are taking down in the States. I've been told by one insurance executive in Toronto that their company pulled out of the southern United States a number of years ago because they could see where damage claims were heading. They could see what the trends were in terms of climate impact. This government is not taking seriously the impact that is coming at us in terms of our homes, not taking seriously the impact that's coming at us in terms of higher insurance prices. It has a weak is too generous. It does not have a climate plan that is of any consequence whatsoever. It is more a document that can be pointed to when someone says, do you have a climate plan? They say, yep, that's it right there. It's failing. It's not defensible in a court of law, but we call it a climate plan. We suggest you do the same. Those are substantial problems. Those are very substantial problems. The government is not facing up to the fact that Ontario, which is a financial services sector hub in North America, depends on a stable finance system. The U.S. Senate had hearings last year about the risk of climate change to the insurance industry. And they published a report late December of 2024, talking about how climate change was going to destabilize the insurance industry. Recently, a major insurance executive in Europe talked about the threat to the insurance industry from climate change, and with a threat to the insurance industry, a threat to the financial services sector in its entirety. This government is not, in fact, acting as one would rationally to protect our economy and our livelihoods. So going forward with geologic storage and saying, well, this is one of our big answers to the climate crisis, it is not a big answer. It is driven by oil and gas interests that want to squeeze more out of the ground. It's driven by natural gas interests that want to say we're making an environmentally defensible product, when in fact that is not the case. I want to speak very briefly about the wildfire section. I didn't see reference to urban wildfire as an issue that needed to be dealt with, not to be highlighted. And I raise this because I'll just go through some of the places that have been hit by urban wildfire. Fort McMurray. If you get a chance to read John Vaillant's Fire Weather, you can get a sense of how scary it is when a city starts going up. Lytton, BC. Lahaina, Hawaii. Los Angeles. No one would have thought that Los Angeles would have a big chunk of that city wiped out by wildfire. 2021, London, UK. Very lucky that grass fires in the suburbs of London did not result in a much bigger fire. In fact, one senior fire official said, if the wind had been different, we would have been looking at a second Great Fire of London. Alberta has now got 6 urban wildfire crews set up. Ontario needs to consider the potential risk of urban wildfire. And that's house-to-house burning. I'm not just talking about trees catching fire in a park. In any event, Speaker, there are fundamental problems with this bill. Thank you.
Question. I recognize the member for Thornhill.
And thank you to the member opposite. You know, we're all concerned about the environment, but this is the reason why it's now more than ever necessary to make these regulations. And there are a number of benefits to regulating this technology, including contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in this province, ensuring timely establishments and commercial framework is critical to enable industries to take advantage of federal funding incentives, such as the Environmental and Climate Change Canada's carbon capture is essentially we're at a moment in time where we have to move now, and I think that utilizing storage investment tax credit, which will decline in value over 2030, is essential to moving positively in this fashion. Will the member opposite support this bill so that we can not only preserve our communities and our industries and also
Question.
Our infrastructures, and support this bill?
Response.
I appreciate the question from the member. And I have to say, yes, we are all concerned, but if you're in a house and the back room has caught fire and your response is to not get people out of the house, then I actually have to ask questions about how concerned you are. We are facing very profound threats and risks from climate change and a government that is not acting. What's in this bill will at best be inconsequential. And I have to say the federal government does not have a good record on climate. We're not meeting our climate targets. The Liberals who've been in power since 2015 have been appalling on the climate issue. Appalling. And so to say we're going to take advantage of these tax credits doesn't mean you're actually going to take on the climate issue. Just means you're going to take advantage of tax credits. We're considering supporting this on second reading to see if there can be amendments made in committee that make the bill useful. But to say this is a concern
Question.
about climate change, not credible.
I recognize the member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say about my colleague and everybody in the House, the biggest concern that we have in the world today is climate change. If we don't have clean air and we don't have clean water, what future are we going to leave for our kids and our grandkids? And I know my colleague has fought his entire adult life on fighting for environmental justice. So I'm going to ask you, this legislation basically sets up a new industry, quite frankly. And do you believe that we need extensive consultation before this bill gets passed?
Response.
I appreciate the question. Yes, I think extensive consultation makes a lot of sense. And I particularly think that those communities along the north shore of Lake Erie deserve to be heard, deserve to have potential risks set out to them. They deserve to see the studies that have been done showing that that risk can be dealt with. And frankly, as far as we can tell, the consultation with First Nations, informed prior consent, that, to my knowledge, has not been done. And this will affect First Nations communities. The member from Niagara, his riding has an awful lot of abandoned oil and gas wells in it. All along the south side of the Niagara Peninsula.
Response.
And in around Sarnia, lots of abandoned oil and gas wells. If I had that riding, I would be very, very concerned of the potential risk here that has not been explored and properly defined.
Question. I recognize the Solicitor General.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate hearing from the member opposite. You know, if we're not bold, if we don't have a vision, if we can't see the forest through the trees, if we can't understand that one way we combat climate change here in our Ontario is look at our energy grid, look at our power generation, and we take it further. This whole concept of carbon storage is reminding all of Ontario that our government under Premier Ford is bold. So my question to the member opposite is, when we look to move forward in a way that is innovative, we can't go back to the days of the candle and the stagecoach. Our economy is not going to go back. We are going forward.
Response.
I appreciate the question from the member, and I have a lot of respect for him. But I don't know if you've seen Ontario's climate plan, but bold and visionary are not the terms that come to mind. Ludicrous, weak, inadequate, those are the words that first come to mind. We don't even meet the targets that were set by the federal government, and the federal government is a slacker on climate issues. We're below the targets necessary to protect our future. So when you talk about bold and visionary, hey, show some bold and visionary. Geologic storage is not bold and visionary. Moving away from natural gas for home heating would be bold and would actually make a big difference. We moved away from coal home heating back in the 60s. Last year, Bill 165, this government undermined the Ontario Energy Board that was trying to protect consumers, protect them from higher bills.
I recognize the member from London West.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I very much appreciate the remarks from my colleague, the member for Toronto-Danforth. I wanted to point out that very soon, in July, we will be marking 4 years since the horrific explosion in Wheatley that rocked that community as a result of an explosion in an abandoned underground mine. I wanted to hear the member's perspective on whether any of the lessons from that tragedy have been reflected and incorporated into this bill.
Response.
I appreciate the question. There are in this bill changes to the relevant act, oil, gas, and salt, which I gather increase the powers of the province to take action around abandoned oil and gas wells. What's not clear to me, and I haven't seen it, is whether or not funds are going to be set aside to actually deal with these abandoned oil and gas wells. So you may have increased enforcement powers, but if you don't have enforcers, officers trained and deployed to take on this issue, having a statute on the books will be irrelevant. At the same time, because the bill is setting things up to pressurize the underground oil and gas storage so that abandoned wells that may not now be visibly problematic could become problematic, says that we're going backwards and forwards at the same time. In fact, we may be going a lot faster backwards if we find that pressurizing one well activates 5, 10, 15 others. We don't know. I'm speculating. But I don't like to speculate about safety and risk. I don't like to speculate about the idea that you may be pumping natural gas into a school or home, into a downtown section of a place like Wheatley. If, in fact, you really care about this issue and learn from the Wheatley explosions, you would not be allowing the oil and gas industry to pump up those old reserves.
Question. I recognize the member from Ottawa-Vanier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And to the member of Toronto-Danforth, I have to say I was a bit surprised to hear you bash down the record of the Liberals on the environmental aspect. Well, I don't know, like, what about the phasing out of the coal power, which brought down the carbon emission by 24%? What about the introduction of cap-and-trade system? What about the expansion of the green belt and all the investment that we did in renewable energy? Like, I know it wasn't perfect, but I don't think that we deserve what you qualified the record that we have achieved.
Response.
Well, again, I get along with the member, and we've had some jokes before about the necessity of disciplining members and the methods that can be used. That said, you know, I was primarily focused on the federal Liberals because they have not set targets that are consistent with what's needed in the world, and they're not meeting those targets. Like, we are consistently one of the bad boys. I actually went to the climate conventions in Germany and South Africa. Canada was seen as one of the bad players by the rest of the world. When Jean Chrétien was in power, we were seen as one of the wreckers that were undermining climate action in the rest of the world. So what we see with the federal Liberal record is appalling, continues to be appalling. If you want to talk about the Liberal record here, the pressure to shut down the gas plants.
I recognize